The third key message in the report, of course, is that we need to act differently going forward. And that really means that growth as we know it is no longer going to be a sustainable option. Now, growth we know is important in terms of the capacity of countries to deal with more complex problems such as adaptation to climate change. Some people would argue that the most effective adaptation is growth, but if that growth is high carbon growth, then we're not in a sustainable world. So one thing we have to do differently is transform energy systems completely. We've looked at the energy modeling results. This is a least cost energy mix to get the world to 2 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And one thing that strikes you is we're going to need everything if we're going to supply enough energy for development and meet that target. And in particular, fossil fuels don't go away. The 3 blue bands at the bottom are fossil fuels. But what does happen is that you see that banding there, that represents carbon capture and storage. So one of the technologies that the modelers are saying is going to be essential if we're going to decarbonize energy supply and decarbonize growth. We then have a series of wedges, a series of bands representing the different low carbon and renewable forms of energy. The most important, we see at the top, that the models are saying we may have a need for significant amounts of nuclear power. They have looked at the options for the alternatives. And what they conclude is without nuclear power, then you start having to grow so many biofuels, you start impinging on food growing lands, you start impinging on ecosystems that we'd like to protect. All those other things start spilling over. So there may be a role in all of this for nuclear power, and of course that is one of the issues that many people are debating. The other important source of energy, and it might sound a little odd to think of energy conservation and energy efficiency as a source of energy, but of course it is. That instead of having something like 600 exajoules of energy supply in 2100, without energy efficiency, that would be as high as 1,300. So energy efficiency in many ways has the most important role to play in decarbonizing growth. Another way we need to act differently in a world where climate is changing and there's a high degree of uncertainty about the future is that we need to change our decision-making paradigms, our models. A good way to think about this is if we think of how we've designed varieties of wheat to be optimized for current climate or for recent climate. And we know the probabilities of extreme weather events, of how extreme the extremes are. So we can say, let's design a type of wheat that will maximize the expected value of production of wheat, given the probabilities we know associated with the existing climate. Now, the problem we face is that we're looking at a future where there's much more uncertainty, where we don't know the probabilities of extreme climate events. We know they'll be more frequent, but we don't know the frequency distribution. And we don't know how extreme the extremes will be, so there's uncertainty about that. So our model of maximizing expected values of yields aren't going to work. We need to think about more robust ways of designing things like wheat varieties. And robustness in this case means, can we design a wheat strain or variety that will perform adequately across the whole range of possible climate outcomes? Now, there's a research agenda here to say, what do we mean by performing adequately? A bottom line would probably be producing enough calories to keep people alive. But we need to think hard about how do we come up with robust strategies for things like designing wheat varieties? How do we come up with robust strategies for managing water in particular? And again, this is all linked to the fact that we no longer know the probability distributions. We no longer can say, how do we maximize expected values? We need robust responses. We're going to need to find finance to make this happen. This is one of the main messages in the report. The chart shows us sort of where we stand. Over 2008 to 2012, we project how much finance will be generated for developing countries through the carbon markets, through other carbon funds, both for mitigation and adaptation. And you come to a number that's less than $10 billion a year over that period. When we look at the literature on what's going to be required to finance adaptation efforts in developing countries, how much will be required to finance mitigation efforts in developing countries? Again, the focus is developing countries here. We see this range for adaptation, $30 to $90 billion, median somewhere around $70 billion. This is in 2030 now. And we see that this huge range on mitigation, $140 to $675 billion required, a median of $400 billion. So we're at 10. We're looking at needing something like $470 billion by 2030. So the gap is there, and it behooves us to think about how do you fill that gap. Now, a World Development Report does not prescribe solutions. It suggests ways forward. It tells us, based on the best knowledge, the latest knowledge, here are some ways forward, but it's not a prescription. So we get the message across. Current volume is not sufficient. We need to scale up. It's also important to think about what is the role that finance plays in all of this, right? Because if we want to stabilize climate, then we need to have effective policies. The policies have to be effective. We want them to be efficient because we don't want to waste resources in trying to solve the climate problem. But efficiency would mean that a lot of mitigation effort in particular would need to take place in developing countries. Think of the curve that Marianne showed us. The yellow bars were the things you can do in developing countries to reduce emissions. So if we want efficiency, we need to take action in developing countries. But if we want that to be equitable, if we don't want poor countries financing a global public good, then we need the flow of finance to make those actions happen, to support those actions. Right? So finance really is the way to square equity, efficiency, and effectiveness. That's really the role it's going to play. And we can see the challenge in front of us. Now, there are a number of ways we can fill that gap. There's existing carbon markets. They need to be reformed. They need to be scaled up, obviously. We can tax the untaxed. There are things like bunker fuels for air travel and marine travel, international transport, that are currently untaxed. You could look at a global carbon tax. It'd be hard to imagine having a large carbon tax, but maybe you could sell a small one. Auctioning a portion of the emission allowances that countries get under the UNFCCC could generate finances that could go to developing countries. So there's a whole spectrum of things we need to do. It's rather like the energy story. In energy, we're going to need all the tools in the toolkit, including some that are just looking like they're possible, and some things that we know we haven't done all the research yet. We're going to need everything to generate, all our tools to generate finance. We're going to need to price carbon, and that will certainly generate finance within country borders, but it won't automatically generate flows of finance to developing countries. So some role for fiscal transfers, some role for allocation and trading of emission allowances is probably also going to be needed in order to generate that flow of money to developing countries. We need a lot more information to manage this problem, right? Particularly when it comes to meteorological systems, meteorological information, hydrology, hydrological information. We need data, we need knowledge in order to come up with these robust policies that I was talking about. And of course, there is a range of high technology that's coming online. What you can do from satellites is more and more impressive in terms of what you can see in the physical changes and the physical measures that you can make of what's happening on the land, from the forest, et cetera, et cetera. But there are also low-tech ways to generate information and use that information to manage your resources. And the picture is from Andhra Pradesh in India, where by giving farmers sufficient knowledge and simple tools, they're able to measure the rate at which they're using the aquifer that they're drawing the water from to use to irrigate their crops, and to agree among themselves how to bring their use of the aquifer down to a sustainable level. So it's not all satellites from space. It's partly what you can do with communities at community level. There are also new pressures for action on climate change. We know we've come a long way in terms of public opinion. We see it in the press, we see it in the polls. People are aware of the problem, increasingly concerned about the problem. We see individuals and organizations responding, households taking actions to make their household carbon neutral, institutions like the World Bank, our operations are carbon neutral. Whether our lending is carbon neutral is another question. But in terms of the operation of our buildings and our air travel and things like that, they're all offset, or we engage in energy saving of one form or another. So institutions are trying to respond. Politics are changing. We've seen a huge change just in the last year, obviously in America. But even before the American election, we saw states and cities starting to take climate action on their own, in spite of inaction at the federal level. We saw a new government elected in Australia that was partly elected on a climate agenda. Right? So we see the politics is changing. We need action. So how do we turn awareness into action? A lot of what has to happen, of course, is more in the soft domain of how do we communicate climate change in a way that will empower people to act and not just scare them. Right? There's a concern that if you just scare people, they feel I'm powerless. So how you communicate is important. Education is important. Social norms. You think of smoking as the social norms around smoking. Go back 30 or 40 years, it was cool to smoke. Now you're almost a social outcast, maybe not quite, but almost a social outcast if you smoke. Social norms do change, and so part of changing how we act with respect to the global climate, the global commons, probably will involve changing social norms as well. And of course we need to create new institutional mechanisms in national governments, regional governments, local governments to coordinate action across different levels. So let me just sum up a few major points and then we're over to discussion. Our main messages on acting now and acting differently, acting together, frame the debate. They say, here's how we frame it, but the core of the report really is about acting differently. What do we need to do differently to take action on climate change? And the main chapters in the report are dealing with that topic. We need to adapt to climate change, which means protecting the poor and vulnerable from climate change. We need to find robust strategies, as I said, to manage land, to manage water. Our way of thinking about these issues has to change. We need to decarbonize growth, as we just saw, while energizing development. You need energy for development, but you need to decarbonize it. We need to find the constituents of a climate agreement that all countries can view as being fair in some sense, if we're going to get an agreement on climate action. We need to generate the finance, and as I just presented, the key role that that's playing is ensuring that any action on climate is going to be fair in the sense of not putting the burden on poor countries, the financing burden. We need new technologies, we know, and so part of what we talk about is catalyzing new technologies. How do we do that? Is it pushing technologies with public sector money? Is it using markets to create demand for new technologies? We need to look at all these things. And finally, this question that I was just talking about, sort of how do we empower citizens to turn their concern into action through the governments they support and the policies they support, and through the actions that they take in their daily lives. So the core of the report is about that.